and Associates law office swung open violently as Margaret Sinclair collapsed into her wheelchair, tears streaming down her face. Behind her, Harold and Vivian Sinclair stormed out, their faces contorted with anger and disbelief. Papers scattered across the marble floor like autumn leaves, deeds, bank statements, and in the center of it all, a will with multiple signatures and seals. "This can't be legal!" Harold shouted, his voice echoing down the hallway, his expensive suit wrinkled from clutching the documents tightly. "We own that house! We've lived there for 30 years!" Lawyer James Pemberton adjusted his metal-rimmed glasses, his voice calm but firm. "I'm afraid the protection clause was very clear, Mr. Sinclair. The moment you changed the locks and removed Mrs. Sinclair's belongings, you activated the full transfer of the inheritance." Margaret's trembling hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair as she stared at her former in-laws. For the first time in weeks, her voice was steady. "You should have read the fine print, Harold. A grieving widow discovered her late husband's final gift, a legal trap that would change everything. 3 months earlier, Margaret Rose Sinclair had been living what she thought was a perfect life. At 52, she moved through the world with quiet grace, despite the wheelchair that had been her companion since a drunk driver shattered her spine 15 years ago. Her days were filled with volunteer work at Riverside General Hospital, where she'd once worked as a head nurse before her accident. The patients adored her warm smile and gentle hands, and she found purpose in organizing the hospital's charity drives and mentoring young nursing students. Margaret's small frame and silver-streaked brown hair often led people to underestimate her sharp intellect and fierce determination. She'd fought her way back from complete paralysis, relearned to drive, and even completed her master's degree in hospital administration from her hospital bed. But beneath her resilient exterior lived a constant fear of abandonment, a wound that never quite healed from her childhood in foster care, bouncing between homes until she aged out of the system at 18. Her marriage to Robert Sinclair had been her sanctuary. They'd met when she was 28 and he was 35, both working late shifts at different departments in the hospital. Robert, a respected cardiac surgeon, had pursued her with old-fashioned courtship, handwritten notes left at the nurse's station, coffee brought precisely how she liked it, and patient conversations about books they'd both read. Even after her accident, when she feared he might leave, Robert had knelt beside her hospital bed and whispered, "You think a little thing like wheels is going to scare me away? I didn't fall in love with your legs, Maggie. I fell in love with your heart." Their home at 1247 Maple Grove Lane had been Robert's family house, a sprawling Victorian that his grandparents had built in 1943. Harold Sinclair, Robert's father, was a retired bank president who wore his authority like an expensive cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. At 78, he still commanded boardrooms and family dinners with equal intensity. His wife Vivian, 74, had been a socialite her entire adult life, organizing charity galas and country club events with military precision. She wore her status like armor, never appearing in public without perfect makeup and designer clothing. Harold and Vivian had tolerated Margaret's presence in their son's life, but never truly accepted her. Family dinners were exercises in subtle cruelty. Vivian would ask pointed questions about why they hadn't had children, while Harold would make comments about understanding limitations when discussing vacation plans. They lived in the carriage house behind the main residence, an arrangement Robert had insisted upon to keep peace in the family. 24 years earlier, Margaret had stood in the garden of the Maple Grove house, her wedding dress flowing in the summer breeze. She'd been so nervous about walking down the aisle on her father-in-law's arm. Her own foster parents had declined to attend. As Harold offered his elbow, she'd whispered, "Thank you for accepting me into your family." Harold's smile hadn't reached his eyes. "Robert's happiness is what matters, dear. I just hope you can make him as happy as he deserves to be." The words had stung then, and the memory still ached years later. Vivian had spent the reception telling anyone who would listen about the challenges of having a daughter-in-law who came from nothing. Margaret had overheard her explaining to Robert's Aunt Catherine that they'd have to make the best of the situation and hope Robert would come to his senses eventually. The night that changed everything had started like any other. Margaret had been driving home from a double shift at the hospital when David Martinez, a 23-year-old construction worker with a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit, ran a red light at 60 miles per hour. The impact had crushed her Honda Civic against a telephone pole, trapping her for 43 minutes while firefighters worked to extract her from the wreckage. She remembered Robert's face when she woke up 3 days later, his eyes red from crying, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. "The doctors say the damage to your spinal cord," he'd started, then stopped, unable to finish. Margaret had reached for his hand and squeezed it. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." That night, Harold had pulled Robert aside in the hospital corridor. Margaret had pretended to sleep while listening to their conversation through the thin walls. "Son, you're young. You could start over, find someone who can give you the life you deserve. Children, a normal marriage. No one would blame you." Robert's response had been immediate and fierce. "Dad, if you ever suggest I leave my wife again, you won't be welcome in my life. Do you understand me?" Harold had never brought it up again, but the resentment in his eyes whenever he looked at Margaret had only grown stronger. Robert had died on a Tuesday morning in October, massive heart attack at age 59 while performing surgery. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd saved hundreds of hearts couldn't save his own. Margaret had been at the hospital gift shop, arranging flowers for the pediatric ward when Dr. Elizabeth Chen had found her with tears in her eyes and trembling hands. The funeral had been Margaret's first taste of what was coming. Harold and Vivian had taken control of every detail without consulting her, choosing the funeral home, the flowers, even the music. When Margaret had quietly suggested including Robert's favorite song, "The Way You Look Tonight," Vivian had fixed her with a cold stare and said, "I think we know what's appropriate for our son better than anyone else, dear." Margaret had bitten her tongue, focusing on supporting Robert's cousins and old medical school friends who'd come to pay their respects. But she'd noticed how Harold introduced her to people. "This is Margaret, Robert's widow," with a pause that somehow made it sound temporary, as if her connection to Robert had died with him. Dr. Sarah Hamilton, Robert's longtime colleague and one of Margaret's closest friends, had pulled her aside during the reception. "Maggie, I don't like the way Harold's been talking. He asked me 3 different questions about the house and Robert's investments. You need to be careful." Margaret had assured her everything would be fine. Robert had always handled their finances, and she trusted that he'd taken care of everything. The first real confrontation had come exactly 1 week after the funeral. Margaret had been in the kitchen, making Robert's favorite soup recipe and freezing portions for later, when Harold and Vivian had let themselves in through the back door. They'd been doing this for years, treating the main house as an extension of their own space, but something felt different this time. "Margaret, we need to talk," Harold had announced, settling himself at the head of the kitchen table as if he owned it. Vivian had remained standing, her arms crossed, looking like a prosecutor about to deliver a closing argument. "We've been thinking about the living arrangements here. This house is far too big for one person, and frankly, the maintenance costs are substantial." Margaret had turned from the stove, wooden spoon still in her hand. "I'm not sure what you mean, Harold. This is my home. Robert and I lived here for 24 years. Her voice had been steady, but her heart was racing. Vivian had stepped forward, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Of course, dear, and you've made some lovely memories here. But you have to be practical. Where will you go when the money runs out? You haven't worked in years. You have no real income. And this house costs a fortune to heat and maintain. We're offering to let you stay in the carriage house. It's much more appropriate for your situation." The word situation had hung in the air like a slap. Margaret had gripped the counter edge, knuckles white. "My situation? You mean being a widow?" The question had been quiet, but Harold had heard the steel underneath. "Don't be dramatic, Margaret. We're trying to help you face reality. Robert was always too soft-hearted when it came to... Well, never mind. The point is, this house should stay in the Sinclair family. Real Sinclair family." Harold's meaning had been unmistakable. Margaret had set down the wooden spoon very carefully, buying herself time to think. I see. And you've decided this how long after my husband's funeral? 7 days? Her voice had been getting stronger with each word. Did it occur to you that I might have some say in what happens to the home I've lived in for over 2 decades? Vivian had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, Margaret. Sweet, naive Margaret. Do you really think Robert left everything to you? This house has been in our family for 80 years. Harold's name is on the deed right alongside Robert's. You're living here by our grace, and that grace has limits. What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments below. Dr. Hamilton had arrived unannounced later that evening, finding Margaret sitting in Robert's study, staring at a framed photo from their wedding day. I brought Chinese food and wine, Sarah had announced, wheeling in a small cart she'd borrowed from the hospital. And before you say you're not hungry, you're eating. Doctor's orders. As they'd shared lo mein and egg rolls, Margaret had recounted the conversation with her in-laws. Sarah's expression had grown progressively more concerned. Maggie, please tell me you've spoken to a lawyer. Please tell me you have copies of Robert's will and insurance policies. Margaret had shaken her head slowly. Robert always handled all that. He said I didn't need to worry about it, that he'd taken care of everything. All the important papers are in his office safe, and I don't know the combination. Sarah had reached across the table and gripped Margaret's hand. Tomorrow morning, we're calling Robert's lawyer, and we're getting a locksmith for that safe. I don't care what it costs. Her voice had been fierce with protective love. These people have been circling like vultures since the day Robert died, and I won't watch them destroy you. 2 years earlier, Margaret and Robert had been sitting in this same study on a snowy February evening. Robert had been unusually quiet all day, and Margaret had finally asked what was troubling him. He'd looked up from the legal documents spread across his desk, his expression serious. Maggie, I need you to promise me something. If anything ever happens to me, don't let my parents push you around. They're going to try, I know them. They've never thought you were good enough for me, and they'll see my death as an opportunity to finally get you out of their lives. He'd stood up and walked to where she sat by the fireplace, kneeling beside her wheelchair. Promise me you'll fight for what's yours. Promise me you won't just roll over and let them take everything we've built together. His hands had been warm on hers, his eyes intense. I'm making sure you're protected, but you have to be strong enough to claim what's rightfully yours. Margaret had squeezed his hands, confused by the urgency in his voice. Robert, what are you talking about? You're not going anywhere. We're going to grow old together, remember? You promised me 40 more years. But she'd made the promise anyway, not understanding then how prophetic his words would prove to be. The next morning had brought their first real victory. James Pemberton, Robert's attorney for over 15 years, had agreed to meet them at his office immediately. Margaret had been nervous about navigating the legal complexities, but Sarah had insisted on coming along for moral support. Pemberton had been a thin, precise man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office had been lined with law books and family photos, and he'd greeted Margaret with genuine warmth. Mrs. Sinclair, I've been expecting your call. I was wondering when you'd come to discuss Robert's will. The first shock had come when Pemberton had produced a thick folder labeled Sinclair Estate, Margaret Rose. Sinclair, primary beneficiary. Margaret's eyes had widened as she'd seen the scope of documents. The will itself had been 12 pages long, with multiple attachments and codicils. Robert was very thorough, Pemberton had explained, settling behind his desk.
He updated his will every 2 years, and he made some very specific provisions regarding your security and the family property. He'd paused, studying Margaret's face carefully. Mrs. Sinclair, did your husband ever discuss his concerns about his parents' intentions regarding your welfare? Margaret had glanced at Sarah, then back at the lawyer. He mentioned once that they might try to push me around after he died, but I thought he was being overly protective.
I never imagined they'd try to take away my home. Pemberton had nodded slowly. Robert was a very smart man. and he knew his parents well. He came to me 3 years ago with a very unusual request. He wanted to create what he called a protective clause, a legal provision that would activate if his parents took any aggressive action against you regarding the family property. The revelation had been staggering. Not only had Robert left Margaret everything, the house, his medical practice partnership, all investments and bank accounts, but he'd also created a complex legal structure designed to protect her from his parents' interference. The protective clause was like a legal landmine, waiting to explode if Harold and Vivian overplayed their hand. The beautiful part, Pemberton had explained, his eyes twinkling with professional admiration, is that the clause only activates if they take specific actions against you. If they'd left you alone, respected your ownership of the property, and treated you with basic decency, they could have continued living in the carriage house indefinitely. But if they attempt to force you out, change locks, remove your belongings, or claim ownership of the main house. He'd trailed off with a meaningful look. Sarah had leaned forward in her chair. What happens then? Her voice had been barely above a whisper. Then, every asset of Robert's estate, including a second property in the Hamptons that his parents have been using as their summer home for 20 years, plus their monthly stipend from Robert's trust fund, transfers permanently to Mrs. Sinclair, with immediate eviction notices for both properties. Pemberton had delivered this information with the satisfaction of a chess master revealing checkmate in 12 moves. Margaret had stared at the lawyer in shock. Robert set up a trap? The words had felt surreal leaving her mouth. Robert set up justice, Pemberton had corrected gently. He knew his parents would show their true colors eventually, and he wanted to make sure their cruelty would have consequences. The question now is, do you want to tell them about the clause and give them a chance to back down, or do you want to wait and see if they spring the trap themselves? Margaret had thought about 24 years of subtle insults, condescending remarks, and barely concealed hostility. She'd remembered Vivian's voice saying, "real Sinclair family," and Harold's implication that she was a burden Robert had been too kind to abandon. "I want to wait," she'd said quietly. "If they're determined to show me who they really are, then they should face the consequences of their choices. Can you guess what happens next? Drop your predictions below." The trap had been set, and Margaret had returned home with copies of all the legal documents safely stored in a new safety deposit box at the bank. Sarah had helped her change the combination on Robert's safe and organize all the financial papers they'd found inside. The scope of Robert's planning had been breathtaking. He'd not only protected Margaret financially, but had also left detailed instructions for managing his investments, and even recommendations for financial advisors she could trust. But Harold and Vivian had interpreted Margaret's newfound confidence as weakness. They'd begun a campaign of psychological warfare designed to wear down her resistance. Vivian had started appearing in the main house at all hours, rearranging furniture and removing items she claimed belonged to the family. Harold had begun intercepting Margaret's mail and questioning delivery drivers about packages addressed to the house. The breaking point had come on a rainy Thursday morning in November. Margaret had been having coffee in the sunroom, reading a letter from one of Robert's former patients, when she'd heard the unmistakable sound of power tools coming from the kitchen. She'd rushed to investigate and found Harold installing new locks on the back door, while Vivian directed 2 men in moving company uniforms who were loading Margaret's personal belongings into boxes. "What are you doing?" Margaret's voice had been sharp with panic and disbelief. Vivian had barely looked up from the inventory list she'd been checking. "We've been patient long enough, Margaret. You've had 6 weeks to make other arrangements, and you've chosen to be stubborn. We're helping you face reality." One of the movers, a kind-faced man named Miguel Santos, had stopped loading boxes and looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, are you sure about this? She seems pretty upset, and she says this is her house." Harold had straightened up from the lock he'd been installing, his face red with exertion and annoyance. "Young man, you're being paid to move boxes, not to ask questions. This woman has been living here rent-free since my son died, and we've been more than generous with our patience." Margaret had watched in growing horror as they'd loaded her photo albums, Robert's medical journals, and even the quilts her foster grandmother had made into the moving truck. "You can't do this," she'd said, her voice breaking. "This is my home. Robert left it to me." Vivian had finally looked directly at her, eyes cold with triumph. "Show me the paperwork, dear. Show me one document that proves Robert left you anything more than his debts and medical bills." Her smile had been cruel. "You can't because you don't have any." Robert was sweet, but he wasn't stupid. He knew this house needed to stay with people who could actually take care of it. 3 years earlier, Robert had sat in James Pemberton's office on a cold January morning, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Jim, I need you to create something that's probably going to sound paranoid, but I know my parents. They've been waiting 40 years for an opportunity to get Margaret out of their lives, and my death will be their chance." Pemberton had leaned back in his chair, studying his longtime client. "What exactly are you worried about, Robert?" The question had been gentle, but Robert had heard the concern underneath. "They're going to try to take everything from her. The house, the money, her security, her dignity, everything. They'll probably wait until after the funeral, let her think she's safe, then start applying pressure. They'll tell her she can't afford the upkeep, that she doesn't belong in the family home, that I couldn't possibly have left everything to someone who isn't really family." Robert's voice had grown bitter as he'd quoted his mother's words. "And they'll be confident that Margaret won't fight back because she's never had to fight for anything in our marriage. I've always protected her, handled the business side of our lives, dealt with my parents' hostility myself." He'd paused, running his hands through his hair. "But I won't be there to protect her anymore, and she's going to have to find her strength on her own." Pemberton had pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes. "So you want to create a provision that protects her inheritance while also giving her parents enough rope to hang themselves with?" His tone had been purely professional, but Robert had caught the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Exactly. If they treat her with basic human decency, they can live out their lives comfortably in the carriage house. But if they try to force her out, steal from her, or treat her like she doesn't belong..." Robert had leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Then they lose everything, and Margaret gets to watch them reap exactly what they've sown." Margaret had stood in her empty kitchen, watching the moving truck disappear down Maple Grove Lane, feeling more alone than she had since Robert's death. But underneath the fear and sadness, something else was growing, a cold, determined anger that reminded her of the strength she'd found during her rehabilitation after the accident. She'd pulled out her cell phone and dialed James Pemberton's number. "Mr. Pemberton, this is Margaret Sinclair. They've taken the bait." Her voice had been steady, with an undertone of steel that would have made Robert proud. "How quickly can we spring the trap?" Pemberton had been in his car within 30 minutes, bringing with him a briefcase full of documents and a grim smile that promised swift justice. Margaret had met him at the front door, which now required her key card instead of the traditional key. Harold's new lock system was already in place. "Mrs. Sinclair, I need you to understand something before we proceed," Pemberton had said as they'd settled in the living room. "Once we activate Robert's protective clause, there's no going back. Your in-laws will lose their home, their monthly stipend, and their claim to any family property. Are you absolutely certain you want to take this step?" Margaret had looked around the living room where she and Robert had spent countless evenings, where they'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where he'd held her hand during her darkest moments after the accident. Now it felt violated, tainted by Harold and Vivian's presumption and cruelty. "Mr. Pemberton, they made their choice when they decided to treat me like a squatter in my own home. They made their choice when they loaded my belongings into a truck like I was being evicted. They made their choice when they decided that 24 years of marriage to their son meant nothing." Her voice had grown stronger with each word. Robert warned them this would happen. He gave them every chance to do the right thing. Now they get to face the consequences. What Margaret hadn't known was that Dr. Sarah Hamilton had been conducting her own investigation. As a longtime member of the hospital board and someone who'd known the Sinclair family for over 2 decades, Sarah had started making discreet inquiries about Harold and Vivian's financial situation. What she'd discovered had been shocking. Harold's bank had been struggling for years before his retirement, and he'd made some questionable investment decisions that had cost his clients substantial money. The only thing that had kept him from facing serious legal consequences had been Robert's monthly payments, officially characterized as a family stipend, but actually functioning as restitution for Harold's professional mistakes. Vivian's charity work, meanwhile, had been funding an increasingly expensive lifestyle. The country club memberships, the designer clothing, the frequent trips to Europe, all of it had been subsidized by Robert's generosity. Without his support, they'd be facing bankruptcy within 6 months. Sarah had called Margaret with this information just as Pemberton was explaining the legal documents. "Maggie, they're not just being cruel. They're desperate. Harold owes money to at least 3 different investors, and Vivian has been writing checks their account can't cover for months. They need to sell that house to save themselves from financial ruin." But Margaret had discovered something even more interesting while going through Robert's papers. Hidden in his desk drawer, she'd found a leather journal where he'd been documenting his parents' behavior toward her for years. Entry after entry detailed their subtle cruelties, their attempts to undermine her confidence, and their barely concealed wish that she'd disappear from their lives. One entry, dated just 6 months before Robert's death, had brought tears to her eyes. Mom made another comment about Margaret's limitations at dinner tonight, suggesting we should consider moving somewhere more suitable for her condition. When I called her out on it, she claimed she was being thoughtful, but I saw the look in Margaret's eyes, that flash of hurt she always tries to hide. I'm tired of watching them chip away at her self-worth, piece by piece. I need to make sure that when I'm gone, they can't continue this psychological torture. The journal had contained over 100 similar entries, creating a detailed record of Harold and Vivian's pattern of emotional abuse. Robert had been building a case against his own parents, documenting their behavior for the legal protection he'd known Margaret would eventually need. Dr. Michael Chen, Sarah's husband, and the hospital's chief administrator, had provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. He'd quietly reviewed the financial records of Robert's medical practice partnership and discovered that Harold had been pressuring the other partners to buy out Robert's share at below market value, claiming that Margaret couldn't be trusted to manage her inheritance properly. "They've been planning this since the day Robert died," Michael had explained during an emergency meeting at Margaret's house. "Harold has been telling everyone that you're mentally unstable, that the grief has affected your judgment, that you need family guidance to make good decisions." Margaret had felt a cold fury building in her chest. "They've been sabotaging my reputation while pretending to help me?" The betrayal had been breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. Sarah had nodded grimly. "And they've been telling people that Robert never meant to leave you the house, that it was an oversight in his will that they're trying to correct out of kindness." Her voice had been tight with anger. "Maggie, they're not just trying to steal your home, they're trying to destroy your entire identity as Robert's wife. What would you have done? Tell us in the comments." The final insult had come that very evening. Margaret had been sitting in the carriage house, the small space Harold and Vivian had generously offered her, when she'd overheard them talking to their neighbor, Eleanor Whitman, over the back fence. "It's really quite sad," Vivian had been saying, her voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "Robert's death seems to have affected her mind. She actually believes he left her everything, can you imagine? Poor dear has been living in a fantasy world, thinking she was somehow entitled to property that's been in our family for generations." Harold's voice had joined in, equally theatrical in its false concern. "We've been trying to help her adjust to reality gently, but she's become quite delusional. Yesterday, she accused us of stealing her belongings when we were simply trying to help her move to more appropriate accommodations." Eleanor, a sharp-minded widow in her 70s, had sounded skeptical. "That doesn't sound like the Margaret I know, Vivian. She's always been one of the most practical women I've ever met." But Margaret had heard the seeds of doubt being planted, had imagined this conversation being repeated throughout their social circle. That night, Margaret had made her final decision. She'd called Pemberton at home and said simply, "Tomorrow morning, we end this." But then something incredible happened that would change everything. The next morning had brought an unexpected ally in the form of Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the local police force who'd also happened to be one of Robert's former patients. Ray had arrived at Margaret's door at 8 a.m. with a concerned expression and a manila folder tucked under his arm. "Mrs. Sinclair, I apologize for the early hour, but I need to discuss something important with you. It's about your husband and some information that's come to light since his passing." Ray had been a tall, solid man with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much over the years. Margaret had invited him into the main house, noting with bitter satisfaction that she still had her keys and Harold's new locks hadn't affected the front door yet. "What kind of information, Detective Morrison?" Ray had settled carefully in Robert's favorite armchair, treating the space with respect. "Ma'am, your husband was something of a private investigator in his spare time. He'd been conducting a very thorough investigation into some financial irregularities involving your father-in-law's former bank." The folder Ray had opened contained photocopies of bank records, investment statements, and what appeared to be tape recordings transcribed to paper. "Dr. Sinclair approached me about 6 months before his death. He'd discovered that Harold had been embezzling money from the bank's investment accounts and using his position to steer clients into bad investments that benefited his personal portfolio." Margaret had stared at the detective in shock. "Robert knew about this?" Her voice had been barely above a whisper. "He'd been investigating for over 2 years. He found evidence that Harold had stolen nearly $800,000 from various client accounts and that the bank's board of directors had quietly covered it up to avoid scandal. Your husband had been making restitution payments to protect his father from prosecution." Ray's expression had been grim. "The monthly stipend your in-laws receive isn't generosity, Mrs. Sinclair. It's extortion." The revelation had recontextualized everything Margaret thought she knew about her marriage and her in-laws' relationship with Robert. "Are you telling me they've been blackmailing their own son?" The words had tasted bitter in her mouth. Ray had nodded slowly. "And now that he's gone, they're in a panic. Without those monthly payments, the victims of Harold's embezzlement schemes are going to start asking questions. They need money fast, and your house represents their only significant asset." But the detective had brought more than just information. He'd also brought an offer from the district attorney's office. "Mrs. Sinclair, we'd like your permission to use Robert's evidence to build a criminal case against Harold Sinclair. Your husband documented everything meticulously, and we have enough evidence to put him away for 20 years. Margaret had felt the room spinning around her. What would that mean for me? For the house? Her practical nature had kicked in, even as she'd struggled to process the enormity of what she was learning. It means that any attempt by your in-laws to claim your property would be seen as an attempt to liquidate assets before criminal prosecution. It means their credibility in any civil matter would be destroyed. And it means, Ray had smiled grimly, that justice would finally be served for the people Harold Sinclair cheated. Meanwhile, James Pemberton had been conducting his own investigation into the moving company Harold and Vivian had hired. What he'd discovered had added another layer to their legal jeopardy. The company, Reliable Moving Services, had been operating without proper licensing and insurance. More importantly, they'd been instructed by Harold to remove property from the house without any legal documentation proving ownership. Mrs. Sinclair, Pemberton had explained during a conference call with Detective Morrison, your in-laws have committed multiple felonies in the last 24 hours: theft, fraud, trespassing, and potentially conspiracy. We don't just have grounds for a civil lawsuit anymore. We have grounds for criminal prosecution. But Margaret had wanted something more than legal victory. She'd wanted Harold and Vivian to face the consequences of their cruelty in the most public and humiliating way possible. Detective Morrison, how many people did Harold steal from? How many families did he hurt? Her voice had been quiet, but Ray had heard the steel underneath. At least 12 families that we know of. Retirees who lost their savings, young couples who lost their house down payments, elderly widows who lost their security. Ray's jaw had tightened with professional anger. And your husband spent the last 3 years of his life quietly making sure those people didn't lose everything because of his father's greed. Margaret had closed her eyes, finally understanding the weight Robert had been carrying, the stress that had probably contributed to his heart attack. Detective Morrison, I want those families to know the truth. I want them to know that Robert died trying to protect them from his own father. Little did Harold and Vivian know, Margaret had been planning their downfall with military precision. Margaret's plan had been elegantly simple and utterly devastating. She'd decided to give Harold and Vivian exactly what they wanted, a public forum to air their grievances about her inappropriate claim to the family property. But she'd also decided to make sure that forum would become the stage for their complete humiliation. The vehicle for justice had come in the form of Eleanor Whitman, the neighbor who'd been skeptical of Harold and Vivian's claims about Margaret's mental state. Eleanor had also happened to be the president of the Riverside Community Association, an organization that hosted monthly meetings attended by most of the neighborhood's longtime residents. Margaret had approached Eleanor with a proposal that had been both humble and strategically brilliant. Mrs. Whitman, I know Harold and Vivian have been spreading concerns about my mental state and my claims to the family property. I'd like to address these concerns publicly and provide documentation of my legal standing. Would it be possible to add this matter to next week's community meeting agenda? Eleanor had agreed immediately, partly out of curiosity and partly out of genuine concern for Margaret's well-being. What Eleanor hadn't known was that Margaret had already arranged for Detective Morrison to attend the meeting, along with James Pemberton, Dr. Sarah Hamilton, and several other witnesses who could speak to both Margaret's mental competence and Harold's financial crimes. Margaret had spent the week before the meeting gathering evidence and preparing her presentation with the thoroughness of a prosecutor building a case. She'd organized Robert's journal entries chronologically, created a timeline of Harold's embezzlement activities, and compiled witness statements from hospital staff who could testify to her emotional stability and professional competence. But the most powerful weapon in her arsenal had been a video recording Robert had made just 3 weeks before his death. She'd found it on his laptop, hidden in a folder labeled, "For Margaret, when you need the truth." In the recording, Robert had been sitting in his study, looking directly into the camera with tired but determined eyes. Maggie, if you're watching this, then I'm gone, and my parents have shown you who they really are. I made this recording because I knew they'd try to rewrite history, to make you doubt your own worth and your rightful place in this family. The video had continued for nearly 30 minutes, with Robert methodically documenting his parents' pattern of emotional abuse toward Margaret, their financial crimes, and his own efforts to protect both her and their victims. He'd concluded by looking directly into the camera and saying, "Margaret Rose Sinclair, you are my wife, my partner, my best friend, and the strongest person I've ever known. Don't let anyone convince you that you're less than everything I knew you to be." Margaret had watched the recording dozens of times, feeling Robert's love and support reaching across the divide between life and death. Each viewing had strengthened her resolve and reminded her that she was fighting not just for herself, but for the truth Robert had died protecting. Can you believe what's about to happen? Drop your predictions in the comments. The night before the community meeting, Harold and Vivian had made their final mistake. They'd hosted a dinner party for 6 of their closest friends, including 2 couples from their country club and Eleanor Whitman herself. Margaret had learned about this gathering from Dr. Hamilton, whose husband Michael had been invited as a courtesy due to his position at the hospital. During the dinner, Harold had regaled his guests with detailed stories about Margaret's deteriorating mental condition and her pathetic attempts to claim property that belonged to his family. Vivian had added her own embellishments, describing Margaret as a gold digger who'd manipulated Robert into marriage and was now trying to steal his inheritance. But they'd made the crucial error of speaking these lies in front of Michael Chen, who'd been recording the conversation on his phone at Sarah's request. Every word of their slander, every cruel characterization, every false claim about Margaret's mental state had been captured in high-definition audio that would soon be played back to the entire neighborhood. Eleanor Whitman had left that dinner party deeply disturbed by what she'd heard. As someone who'd known Margaret for over 20 years, she'd found Harold and Vivian's claims increasingly difficult to believe. Their eagerness to destroy Margaret's reputation had struck her as both excessive and suspicious. That night, Eleanor had called Margaret with an offer that had been both generous and strategically perfect. "Margaret, dear, I think tomorrow's meeting is going to be more contentious than I initially expected. Would you like me to arrange for the session to be recorded for the community's records? That way, there can be no disputes about what was actually said." Margaret had accepted gracefully, knowing that Eleanor had no idea she was helping to create a permanent record of Harold and Vivian's downfall. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Whitman. I think transparency will serve everyone's interests." The stage was set, the trap was armed, and Harold and Vivian Sinclair were about to walk directly into the perfect storm of their own making. The Riverside Community Center had never hosted a more explosive meeting in its 40-year history. By 7 p.m. on that cold November evening, every seat in the main conference room was occupied, with additional attendees standing along the walls. Word had spread through the neighborhood that the Sinclair family drama was about to be resolved publicly, and nobody wanted to miss the confrontation. Margaret had arrived 15 minutes early, wheeling herself to a table at the front of the room where she'd carefully arranged her documents, laptop computer, and a small stack of photo albums. She'd dressed conservatively in a navy blue suit that Robert had always said made her look professional and confident. Her silver hair had been swept back in an elegant bun, and despite the nervous flutter in her stomach, her hands had been steady. Harold and Vivian had made their entrance like conquering royalty, nodding graciously to their friends and supporters while pointedly ignoring Margaret's presence. Harold had worn his most expensive suit, the one he'd reserved for bank board meetings, while Vivian had been resplendent in designer jewelry and a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. Eleanor Whitman had called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m., her voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're gathered tonight to address concerns that have been raised regarding the Sinclair family property at 1247 Maple Grove Lane. Mrs. Margaret Sinclair has requested the opportunity to address these concerns publicly, and Mr. and Mrs. Harold Sinclair have agreed to participate in this discussion." Margaret had begun her presentation quietly, her voice steady and clear, as she'd outlined the basic facts of her marriage to Robert and his sudden death 3 months earlier. She'd spoken about their life together, their shared commitments to the community, and her desire to continue living in the home they'd shared for 24 years. "I understand that some questions have been raised about my mental competence and my legal standing regarding the family property," Margaret had said, her tone remaining respectful and measured. "I've asked several professional colleagues to attend tonight's meeting to address these concerns directly." Dr. Sarah Hamilton had been the first witness, providing a detailed assessment of Margaret's mental state and professional competence. As the head of psychiatry at Riverside General, Sarah's credentials had been impeccable, and her testimony had been clear and unambiguous. "I've known Margaret Sinclair professionally and personally for over 15 years, Sarah had stated, looking directly at Harold and Vivian as she spoke. "I've worked with her on numerous hospital committees, observed her manage complex administrative challenges, and spent countless hours in her company both before and after her husband's death. In my professional opinion, she shows no signs of mental deterioration, cognitive impairment, or emotional instability that would affect her ability to make sound decisions." James Pemberton had followed with a legal overview of Robert's will and Margaret's inheritance rights. He'd been careful to avoid revealing the protective clause, but he'd been thorough in documenting Margaret's legal ownership of all disputed property. "Robert Sinclair's will is unambiguous and legally sound," Pemberton had explained, holding up the document for the entire room to see. "Mrs. Margaret Sinclair is the sole beneficiary of her husband's estate, including the family home at 1247 Maple Grove Lane. Any claims to the contrary are simply incorrect." It was at this point that Harold had made his first serious mistake. Rising from his seat with theatrical indignation, he'd addressed the room with the commanding presence he'd once used to intimidate bank customers and junior employees. With all due respect to Mr. Pemberton, there are aspects of this situation that he's not qualified to address, Harold had declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. My son Robert was a generous man, perhaps too generous, and his relationship with Margaret was complicated by her condition and her background. Margaret had felt the familiar sting of Harold's coded language, the way he could make her disability and her foster care childhood sound like character flaws. But this time, instead of shrinking from his words, she'd felt a cold satisfaction. He was hanging himself with his own rope, exactly as Robert had predicted. Vivian had stood to join her husband, her voice sickeningly sweet as she'd addressed the room. We've tried so hard to handle this situation privately, to spare Margaret the embarrassment of having her limitations discussed publicly. But since she's chosen to make this a community matter, I think it's important for everyone to understand the full context. What happened next would become legend in the neighborhood for decades to come. Vivian had continued her attack on Margaret with increasing viciousness, apparently believing that the public setting gave her license to finally voice all the cruelty she'd been holding back for 24 years. Margaret has never really been part of our family, Vivian had declared, her voice growing stronger as she'd warmed to her theme. She trapped Robert into marriage when he was young and idealistic, and she spent the last 2 decades draining his resources and limiting his opportunities. Do you think it's a coincidence that they never had children? Do you think it's a coincidence that Robert worked himself to death trying to support her medical expenses and her lifestyle? The room had gone deadly quiet, with even Harold looking uncomfortable at his wife's naked hostility. Margaret had remained perfectly still, her expression calm and attentive, as if she were listening to an interesting lecture rather than a character assassination. Robert left detailed instructions with his medical partners about Margaret's instability. After his death, Harold had added, apparently deciding to support his wife's scorched earth approach. He was concerned about her ability to make rational decisions, especially regarding financial matters. The family home requires management and maintenance that, frankly, Margaret is not equipped to handle. Eleanor Whitman had looked increasingly disturbed by the Sinclairs' presentation. Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair, these are very serious accusations about Mrs. Margaret's mental capacity. Do you have documentation to support these claims? Vivian had smiled with cruel satisfaction. Eleanor, dear, sometimes the most obvious truths don't require documentation. Look at her. A crippled woman from foster care who manipulated a successful doctor into marriage and has been living off his earnings ever since. Now she's trying to claim ownership of property that's been in our family for 3 generations. Isn't the pattern clear enough? That was the moment Margaret had been waiting for. She'd reached into her briefcase and withdrawn a small digital recorder, placing it carefully on the table in front of her. With deliberate precision, she'd pressed the play button and filled the room with the sound of Harold and Vivian's voices from the dinner party 3 nights earlier. The pathetic thing is, she actually believes Robert left her everything. Vivian's recorded voice had been crystal clear through the room's sound system. Poor dear has been living in a fantasy world, thinking she was somehow entitled to property that's been in our family for generations. Harold's voice had joined the playback. We've been trying to help her adjust to reality gently, but she's become quite delusional. Yesterday, she accused us of stealing her belongings when we were simply trying to help her move to more appropriate accommodations. The room had erupted in shocked murmurs as people realized they were listening to Harold and Vivian's private conversation. Margaret had let the recording play for several more minutes, capturing every cruel characterization, every false claim, every calculated lie they'd told about her mental state. When the recording had ended, Margaret had looked directly at her in-laws, her voice perfectly steady. Harold, Vivian, you've just heard yourselves describing me as delusional and mentally incompetent. Yet tonight, in front of this same community, you're making identical claims and expecting people to believe they're based on genuine concern rather than calculated cruelty. But Margaret hadn't been finished. She'd opened her laptop and connected it to the room's projection system, filling the large screen with Robert's face from his final video message. Before we go any further, Margaret had announced, I think everyone should hear from Robert himself about his parents' concerns for my welfare and their claims to the family property." Robert's voice had filled the room with quiet authority as he'd begun documenting his parents' pattern of emotional abuse toward Margaret. The audience had listened in growing shock and discomfort as Robert had methodically detailed years of subtle cruelty, financial manipulation, and barely concealed hostility. "My parents have spent 24 years waiting for an opportunity to remove Margaret from their lives," Robert's recorded voice had stated with devastating clarity. "They've never accepted her as part of our family, and they've made her feel unwelcome in her own home for decades. I'm making this recording because I know they'll use my death as an excuse to finally destroy the woman I love." Harold and Vivian had watched their son's testimony with growing horror, realizing that their carefully constructed narrative was collapsing in real time. Vivian had tried to interrupt several times, but Eleanor Whitman had firmly insisted that the recording be allowed to play in its entirety. The video had concluded with Robert looking directly into the camera and delivering his final message. "Margaret Rose Sinclair, you are my wife, my partner, my best friend, and the strongest person I've ever known. Don't let anyone convince you that you're less than everything I knew you to be." The silence that followed had been absolute. Even the sound of traffic outside had seemed muted as the community absorbed the full implications of what they'd just witnessed. Margaret had allowed the silence to stretch for nearly 30 seconds before speaking again, her voice carrying a strength and authority that nobody in the room had heard before. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've now heard 3 different versions of the same story. You've heard Harold and Vivian's public claims about my mental incompetence and their rightful ownership of the family property. You've heard their private admissions that these claims are calculated lies designed to steal my inheritance, and you've heard my late husband's detailed documentation of their decades-long campaign of emotional abuse." She'd paused, letting her words sink in. "The question now is, which version sounds most truthful to you?" What happened next had exceeded even Margaret's expectations. Detective Ray Morrison had stood up from his seat in the back of the room, his badge clearly visible as he'd walked to the front. "Mrs. Sinclair, thank you for providing this forum for community discussion. I think this is an appropriate time for me to address some additional concerns that have come to light regarding the Sinclair family situation." Harold's face had gone pale as Morrison had approached the front of the room. "Detective Morrison, I'm not sure what you think you're doing here, but this is a private family matter." Morrison had smiled grimly. "Actually, Mr. Sinclair, it stopped being a private family matter the moment you began committing felonies to steal your daughter-in-law's property. But before we discuss your recent criminal activities, I think the community should know about your previous ones." The detective had opened his own folder and begun reading from the financial documents Robert had compiled. "Harold Sinclair, during your tenure as president of Riverside Community Bank, you embezzled approximately $800,000 from client investment accounts. You used your position of trust to steer elderly and vulnerable clients into high-risk investments that benefited your personal portfolio while devastating their retirement savings." The room had erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs. Harold had tried to object, but Morrison had continued relentlessly. "Your son Robert discovered your crimes 3 years ago and has been making monthly restitution payments to your victims ever since. The family stipend you've been receiving isn't generosity. It's blood money, paid to keep you out of prison." Vivian had sunk into her chair, her face white with shock and humiliation. Several community members had pulled out their phones, recording the detective's revelations for posterity. Morrison had turned to address the broader room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if any of you lost money in investments recommended by Mr. Sinclair between 2018 and 2021, I encourage you to contact the district attorney's office. We're building a comprehensive case, and we need your testimony." Margaret had watched with satisfaction as several hands had gone up around the room. The victims of Harold's crimes had been sitting in the same audience where he'd tried to destroy her reputation, but Morrison hadn't been finished. "Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair, you're also facing charges related to your activities in the last week: theft, fraud, trespassing, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. The moving company you hired has been operating without proper licensing, and they've agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for reduced charges. Harold had finally found his voice, but it had come out as a pathetic croak. This is all a misunderstanding. We were trying to help Margaret manage affairs that were too complex for her to handle alone. Margaret had chosen that moment to deliver her final blow. She'd reached into her briefcase and withdrawn the legal documents James Pemberton had prepared, spreading them across the table for everyone to see. "Harold, Vivian, I want to thank you for making this decision so easy for me," Margaret had said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You see, Robert didn't just leave me the family property in his will. He also created what's called a protective clause, a legal provision that would activate if you ever tried to force me out of my home or steal my inheritance." She'd paused for effect, watching the growing horror on her in-laws' faces. "By changing the locks on my house and removing my personal belongings, you activated that clause. As of this morning, you've lost your right to live in the carriage house. Your monthly stipend has been permanently terminated, and the summer home in the Hamptons that you've been using for 20 years now belongs entirely to me." The room had gone completely silent as people absorbed the full magnitude of the reversal. In their eagerness to destroy Margaret, Harold and Vivian had destroyed themselves instead. James Pemberton had stood to address the room officially. "Ladies and gentlemen, as of 9 a.m. this morning, eviction notices have been served on both Sinclair properties. Harold and Vivian Sinclair have 30 days to vacate all family premises and remove their personal belongings." Vivian had finally spoken, her voice breaking with desperation. "Margaret, please. We're family. Surely we can work something out. We're old, we have nowhere to go, we've made mistakes, but we can change." Margaret had looked at her mother-in-law with eyes that held no trace of the softness Harold and Vivian had mistaken for weakness. "Vivian, you just spent 30 minutes telling this entire community that I'm a mentally incompetent gold digger who trapped your son into marriage and doesn't deserve to be considered part of your family." She'd paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You were right about one thing. We're not family anymore. You made sure of that." 6 months later, Margaret Sinclair had been hosting her first annual charity benefit in the gardens of 1247 Maple Grove Lane. The event had raised over $50,000 for foster children in the local school district, and the guest list had included most of the neighborhood, several hospital board members, and Detective Ray Morrison, who'd become a close family friend. Harold Sinclair had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud. The trial had been a media sensation, with multiple victims testifying about the devastation his crimes had caused to their families. Vivian had avoided prison, but had been ordered to pay substantial restitution and perform community service at the same foster care facility, where Margaret now volunteered weekly. Margaret had used the proceeds from selling the Hamptons property to establish the Robert Sinclair Memorial Fund, providing college scholarships for foster children pursuing medical careers. She'd kept the main house exactly as Robert had left it, but had converted the carriage house into a guest facility for visiting families of long-term hospital patients. Dr. Sarah Hamilton had stood on the terrace that evening, watching Margaret laugh with a group of nursing students she was mentoring, and marveled at the transformation. The tentative, wounded woman who'd sat in the carriage house 6 months earlier had evolved into a confident philanthropist and community leader. "She's remarkable, isn't she?" James Pemberton had joined Sarah at the terrace railing, both of them watching Margaret navigate her wheelchair between garden tables with practiced ease. Sarah had nodded, smiling. "Robert would be so proud. He always said she was the strongest person he'd ever known, but I don't think even he realized just how strong she could become when pushed to her limits." Eleanor Whitman had approached them, holding a glass of wine and shaking her head in amazement. "I have to admit, I had my doubts about Margaret when Harold and Vivian were spreading their poison around the neighborhood. But watching her handle that community meeting, seeing the grace with which she's managed this entire situation, I've never been more wrong about anyone in my life." Margaret had wheeled over to join their conversation, her face glowing with contentment and purpose. "Ladies, gentlemen, thank you all for being here tonight. Robert always said this house was meant to bring people together, to be a place where the community could gather and support each other. She'd paused, looking out over the gardens where dozens of people were enjoying food, wine, and companionship under the setting sun. I think he'd be happy to see his dream finally coming true. But as Margaret had spoken those words, a delivery truck had pulled into the driveway. A courier had approached the group with an envelope marked, "Urgent Legal Documents, Margaret Sinclair." Margaret had accepted the envelope with a puzzled expression, carefully opening it as her friends watched with concern. As she'd read the contents, her face had gone through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally, a slow smile that had promised another story entirely. "What is it, Margaret?" Sarah had asked, noting the mysterious smile playing at her friend's lips. Margaret had folded the papers carefully, tucking them into her purse. "It seems Harold and Vivian had one more secret they forgot to mention. Apparently Robert wasn't their only child." And that's how justice was served, with a twist that proved karma never stops working. Sometimes the universe saves the best surprises for last, and Margaret Sinclair was about to discover that her story of triumph was just the beginning of an even more incredible journey. Sometimes karma takes time, but it never misses its target. Subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and redemption, because the universe always has more surprises in store for those brave enough to fight for what's right.